Loki has been nerfed, Miss Marvel has been nerfed, and Annihilus has been nerfed. That is 3 of the top decks on my tier list. Let's break it down. As a note, this patch did leak, but it appears it did not leak in its final form. Loki in the leak was a 4-6 with this new text, but is a 4-5 in the actual patch. Now, what this new text means effectively is straightforward. Loki no longer works with Collector. They are also changing how transformed cards work so that they still do work with Quinjet, which means that Spider-Ham's Spider-Pig will now turn into an actual functional card with Quinjet on the board. That said, this is a significant nerf to the card Loki as it is currently constructed. It is basically saying, you can no longer play Collector with Loki, or more accurately, you no longer have to play Collector with Loki. The weird thing about this change to me is that I still feel like I'll want to play Loki in the same shell, which is a deck that creates cards out of thin air with Agent Coulson and Snowguard. And that deck still wants Collector. So there's this very real question of, are we still a Collector Loki deck? Do we need to be playing Collector? Because I think that archetype still wants to play Loki. Without Loki, Collector might not be good enough, but there's this very real tension where it just like it took a piece of the archetype that it goes in and said it got worse in the only deck that goes in. It's a very odd nerf to me. To me, it strikes me as something, I wish they had done more to this. That said, I do expect Loki to turn into the good guy pretty quickly. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned that the top 3 decks in my meta tier list were all nerfed. The one that wasn't is Thanos Blob, and Loki will probably still remain quite strong into that, especially as long as Quinjet is around. Now, that matchup is no longer as free as it used to be for Loki because Blob is asymmetric. It's bigger for the Thanos player than it is for the Loki player, but that is still a good matchup for Loki, and it might be the kind of deck that needs to be around in order to keep that Thanos Blob control Lockjaw style deck in check in this new metagame. So, is this going to be good? I am of the opinion that I actually think current Loki, even without the Collector, will still be a pretty good card. It'll be the kind of card that you need to whip out in certain metagames, and I think we might be heading into one of those metagames thanks to the overwhelming presence of Thanos. This is now a card that is mostly going to be relegated to a sort of backseat role in Zabu decks where it becomes a mid-range haymaker. Its job is going to be to beat the other mid-range decks by cheating, and that is effectively what it's still going to be able to do. It is not going to be an archetype unto itself anymore. It is going to be a supportive card in archetypes that can currently support it, and those archetypes look to be mid-rangey, Zabu-y, Agent Coulson-y, Snowguard-y type decks like Dumb Guy Loki, the one that I'm currently playing on ladder. I don't actually know how much worse that gets. There's just some real questions as to whether or not we actually want to run the Collector, but I do expect Loki to remain pretty good. Another change from the leaked patch is that Miss Marvel was leaked as staying at the same 4-5 stat line, but is actually in the real patch going to 4-4. Now, this might not strike many people as a very large change, because the change is actually mostly to the text of the card. What Miss Marvel now requires is that there be 2 units in each lane, and because of that, she's going to be a little bit more dependent on either your early game or your late game spreading across the board. Cards that I expect to see increase in value in Miss Marvel decks include Dr. Doom and Jeff the Baby Landshark, as those are cards that are very easily able to make this into a significant non-change, right? You can still basically play Miss Marvel as Miss Marvel as long as those cards are in your deck, because you are very often going to be able to just make her a 4/15, and when you make her a 4/15, that's pretty damn good. One thing that I do think will actually see some damage from this, though, is I don't know how much of a generic stat stick she can be. I think she'll still be a good one, but the issue she'll have is that in the games where you're not curving out early, she ends up being very, very, very risky. If you are not able to turn her on, you end up in these situations where she is genuinely not very good, and the metagame is already full of these decks that are playing Rogue and Enchantress and just shutting her down. So while I do think she'll be a significant part of the metagame, and I think that her top end will remain mostly the same, like when you pull everything off, she will not feel like she got nerfed at all. There will be more games where she is bad, and currently there are basically no games when she is bad. So they are adding some games where this card is actually not the greatest card of all time, not a 415 or, a 414 going forward. And I do think they might need to touch it a little bit more in the future. I'm interested to see how this holds up, but it's also worth discussing the metagame context that allowed Miss Marvel to be such an overstated beast is that she was previously competing with cards like Angela that would scale very high, with Elsa Bloodstone that would scale very high, with Werewolf by Night that would scale very high, and she matches up poorly into those. But when those cards all got nerfed, she was the one that remained. She is still, as a 414, probably the strongest stat stick in the game. It's just a question of how you're going to make her work at this point. I do think that this and Blob are what it is likely that the metagame will revolve around going forward. Blob remains obviously extremely strong. Miss Marvel, if you can get her to work, is a 414, which is not far off being a 415, and we can all agree that was pretty ridiculous. She's just going to require a little bit more investment on the deck building side rather than being a free roll everywhere. Another change from the leak, Annihilus was leaked as going to 5-5, but is actually only going to 5-6, and is now getting the new text, as in the leak, of only cards with power below 0 are going to switch sides. And I gotta be honest, as someone who plays a lot of Annihilus, I'm very grateful that he's not going to 5-5, and I actually think he's still going to be quite good if we can figure out a shell for him to work in. Obviously, the Annihilus bounce shell seems like it would make sense. We can maybe try some Miss Marvel stuff, just classic mid-range. But generally speaking, the way to play Annihilus is with the Hood and with Sentry, and when you do that, it's extremely powerful, and that's not changing. So really what's happening is he's just getting a power knocked off, but that doesn't change how dangerous he is with the Hood and with Sentry, so I honestly will continue playing this card probably. It's a very, very dangerous and powerful card where a lot of its power does not get derived from its stats. Its power is derived from the context of, sending a Hood over is effectively a 6 power swing. Sending a -10 Void over is effectively a 20 power swing. Like, these are big, big, big deals when you play this card. 1 point on it does not matter so much. 2 points really does start mattering because you're not always doing that and you need him to be an actual body. But I do feel a lot better at about 5-6 than I did about 5-5. I certainly still plan to play some Annihilus whenever I get the chance, and I am very happy that he's not getting completely dunked on, because I do think that his version of the bounce deck has taken probably the most hits out of anything. The Black Widow hit, the Werewolf hit, and now this hit. It has taken more hits than Loki, and probably, I would say definitely, was less played than Loki, so we'll just leave that there. Whether or not it was better or worse, I think I'll leave up to you. I'm actually really excited for this version of Kingpin, because I want to play him in a move shell before people figure out that Loki still beats the move shells, and I want to use this guy as, like, second Kraven. I think that there are so few legitimate scaling 2-drops in the game now that this guy might actually be a good one. Like, if you can use Arrow or Magneto or, Stegron or Juggernaut to get this guy actual power, you can get him to be like a 2-7, and I'm a big fan of playing decks like that, especially when you have these situations where it's like Kraven's in one lane, Kingpin's in the other, you Juggernaut and Stegron on the middle lane. That seems super awesome to me. One other thing I like about this guy is that he's kind of an inbuilt counter to move mirrors, which means hopefully just a little bit ahead of the curve will... One other thing I like about this guy is that he's sort of an inbuilt counter to move mirrors, which could be good or bad depending on your perspective. If you're the person who has Kingpin and your move mirror opponent doesn't, you are going to feel very smart, but if you both have Kingpin, it does feel like it's going to be very who drew the Kingpin type game. It does seem like the kind of card where if this becomes a staple in the move deck and the move deck becomes a staple in the metagame, the mirrors are going to get really bad because of this guy. I do worry about that, but I also think that it is relatively unlikely that both of those things occur. Either that A, he becomes a staple in the move deck, or B, the move deck becomes a staple in the metagame. I think it is more likely than not that, maybe only one of those things occurs. Maybe maybe zero of those things occur. Maybe both of them do, but I think it's more likely that zero or one of those things occur. Kingpin is a card I'm excited about, but not a card that I expect to see a ton of. I'm just glad that he's no longer in his useless form as a 3/4 counter to the move archetype, and I do think that it's good that there is an actual counter to the move archetype at 2 cost that people might want to play. I am straight up terrified of this card. Quake seems like she will be not only an incredibly good card, but an incredibly tough to play around card. There are so many locations that this becomes incredible with. And frankly, when I look at this card, I see 2 Energy Legion. And I don't think I can express to you just how much of a potential upgrade that is. Legion at 5/7 is taxing you very heavily. You are spending 5 energy on something that is significantly below rate in order to get a great return. Compare Legion to Annihilus, right? Like, these are the kind of things that other people are getting out of their 5-drops. You're getting Legion, right? Your reason you do that is because the ability to scam lanes and abuse locations in Marvel Snap is very, very, very powerful. The ability to do so in a predictable way where you know the outcome and your opponent doesn't is extremely powerful. Quake gives you that now, in a way that is slightly less powerful than Legion, but probably strong enough that she ends up becoming a better option. The reason I think this is when you think about what a lot of Legion plays are, most of them are not, oh, I'm going to flood the board with squirrels or rocks. Most of them are, I'm going to get rid of that location that makes the game hard for me and replace it with one that makes the game easy for me. Now, this can mean various things with Baxter building. It can mean various things with the Nexus. It can mean various things with Negative Zone. It can mean various things with Xandar. It can mean various things with Mojo World. And the thing about this card is that she does all of that too, but she costs 2. I think this is going to be an actual nightmare of a card. Like, this is a horrifying card to consider on turn 6. There is almost always going to be something absolutely abysmal that your opponent will be able to do to you with this, and you will have to consider it. And then they will have to consider, what if they unquake me? Where does the quake go? How do I play around all the possible permutations of locations? Because that's what this card fundamentally looks like to me, is that I have to play around every location being everywhere. That sounds awful to me. But, I don't expect it to be that bad in the context of like, oh, it's just going to be like horrible or like it's going to be unplayable, like the meta's going to suck. It's going to be a fun meta. I do expect this card to be fun. I just don't want it to be... Like, the thing about Legion was that Legion largely had the effect of smoothing things out, right? A lot of the time you'd play Legion and it would just be like to get rid of a bad location. This card is screwing someone over more often than not, and I think you're going to feel a sting when she gets played against you, in a way that Legion will not always sting. I don't know exactly how relevant this card is going to be immediately, because a lot of the decks it seems to want to go into me are these sort of mid-range style decks that match up poorly into decks like Thanos and potentially Loki if that survives. And I do think that this might be a card that takes a little bit to get into the metagame because, the blob sort of has an effect on this where it's like, yeah, okay, nice location trick, I'm 40 power, right? I do think that there is some of that there, and I also think that, if you're playing this deck in your, like, mid-range deck, your move mid-range deck, your brood mid-range deck, what have you, you just end up kind of getting run over by Loki because they just do all the things that your deck wants to do, and then they get your Quake, and it's cheaper, and it's like, okay, that's very annoying. But I am scared of this card. I really, really am. This is a card that legitimately worries me, not necessarily in terms of power level, but in terms of play pattern. It's definitely a powerful card, in my opinion, significantly better than Scarlet Witch, and the smarter you are, the better it's going to be for you. The more clever you are with this card, the more free wins you're going to get, and any card that costs 2 and has free wins in it has been good in the past. When you look at the entire history of 2-cost cards, the ones with built-in free wins. Most recent example is Shadow King. Those are the ones that dominate. Dracula is getting a 1 power buff and a little bit of a change to his wording that effectively amounts to nothing, and literally, as far as I can tell, this is just a 1 power buff. Dracula is now 1 power stronger and slightly worse when your opponent scorpions him or you play him into a lane with a Cyclops. That's pretty much it. This feels like a lateral move for me because Dracula was not like ever really gonna get 1 point. Doesn't seem to matter to this guy. He's either like a million points or he's no points. And I just don't think the 1 point is extremely relevant on a card like that. It reminds me a little bit of when they were like, let's take 1 point away from Shuri. It's like in reverse. Let's give 1 point to Shuri. It's like, okay, I just think this is a card on which 1 point matters a lot less than the majority of cards in the game Marvel Snap. Generally, I like to say people underestimate how much 1 point does matter, but I think specifically with the card Dracula, who you only play to like discard Infinite or Giganto, I don't really know how much of a difference it's gonna make. You're either discarding Infinite or Giganto, or you're playing Apocalypse discard, in which case he gets arbitrarily large anyway. And so it's like, I just don't know how much 1 point matters on this guy specifically. I think it's very reminiscent of those Shuri nerfs where it's like, I think this is possibly the least impactful point of power in the game. But it is a buff, and I will, okay, yeah, sure. I'm probably not going to play any more Dracula because of this buff. I think any time I would be playing Dracula, I probably would have played it without that extra power. But yeah, I'm not going to complain about a free power. Angel, getting a little bit of a text modifier. Now, instead of flying out of your deck, he also flies out of your hand. I think most of the time, him flying out of your hand is going to feel about as bad as drawing him has always felt. He's still not a card you want to draw. He's still not a card you want to put in your deck. The reason you want this card to exist is so you can pull him out of the deck and get some deck thinning done. The stats are mostly irrelevant. And I do think that when you're going through what the destroy archetype looks like, it gets harder and harder to figure out where this guy even fits. This is a card that I've thought about playing in like Thanos decks before, so I can like pull him out of there, but even then it's like kind of sussy. I just don't think it actually makes a lot of sense. And yeah, probably not going to be playing Angel in any of the decks that I play. In case you couldn't tell from that extremely high-pitched suspect voice that I was doing there, I still think this card is quite bad. I don't think this change does anything to change it. It might make it go from literally the worst card in the game to like the second worst card in the game, but honestly, this reminds me of when they changed Uatu, and they were like, oh, we need to be really careful with this, let's make it a 1-1, and then it was terrible, and they were like, okay, let's make it a 1-2, and then it was terrible, and it's like, the problems with this card go a little bit deeper, and I guess maybe in some sense they're not problems so much as they are just obstacles to it being good or competitive, but that's not necessarily to say that every card needs to be competitive or every card needs to have an end game use. Angel is pretty clearly so that early pool players can have some payoff to their destroy effects, which otherwise is much gated behind like much more expensive cards. Like obviously not every card needs to be competitive in end game, and I mean, I guess it's more fair to say that Angel is, he doesn't have to be competitive at endgame. I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to seeing him in decks in Pool 1. It's not like the worst thing ever. The free stats matter more there for sure, right? So, yeah, I mean, I actually kind of think this is a smart change. I think it's a good one. It makes him feel better. I don't think it does a single thing to alleviate the issues that make him a bad card at high-end Marvel Snap. So, overall thoughts. My first thought upon seeing this patch is that I think Thanos Blob is going to be the deck to beat going forward. Blob is one of the pillars of the metagame right now, and probably the only pillar that was actually untouched. He remains an absolutely out of whack card with the rest of the power scale that Marvel Snap has. Even in my Thanos Zoo deck, which has only small cards in it, he is very often just the Infinite without the restriction, and that's a very, very, very powerful card when you can get it. He is much stronger in Thanos than he is basically anywhere else, and Thanos is very much supported by the fact that it gets to run this effectively downsideless 620 to 640. He's very, very, very strong. Thanos is very, very, very strong, and one of the things I expect to see from this patch is less people playing Loki, which means Thanos will have a lot freer reign on the metagame. When it comes to beating Thanos, Loki has always been my preferred option, and he will probably remain my preferred option. But I do wonder if this is opening the door to what I could describe reasonably as an absolute hellscape of a metagame. Because I gotta tell you, the Blob-Thanos 50-50s remind me a lot of the peak Eliath metagame, and I would be worried if that is what the metagame sort of devolved into. And I think there is a decent chance that it will, and that Loki will be the savior we all need. I do think Thanos will end up public enemy number 1. I don't know how permanent that state will be. I will certainly be building to attack it as soon as possible, because I would expect to see it everywhere. As far as Miss Marvel, I would expect to see a lot of her too, but I think that's fine, right? Like, it's fine that this card can be the best 4-cost in the game for stats. That's fine. It just can't have too many stats, and they can't be too easy. Like, you are allowed to print strong cards when you make a Marvel Snap card. You could do strong stuff. It just can't be too strong. And I think the question we have here is, can Miss Marvel be a good to great card and not be oppressive? And I'm interested to figure out the answer. As far as the rest of these changes, I still do expect to play Annihilus. I still do expect it to be good. I will try some move mid-range. I expect to be disappointed with it, but I will try it. And I will also likely be playing an absolute ton of Quake. I am pretty excited to see what she can do, although I do worry about her place in the metagame. Maybe she ends up on more of a Black Knight trajectory where it takes a little bit after the change for people to figure out exactly what to be doing with her. But I do think that she is an extremely strong card now. And boy, am I scared of her, because we might be going straight into that Blob 50-50 meta and also the Quake 50-50 meta. You're not going to know what's going to happen on turn 6 ever. It's all guessing now. We're coin flipping. I hope it's a little bit different from that. I certainly will be trying to brew decks that are different from that. Thank you so much for making it this far in the video. I've been Cam Best. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.